3, 2, 1.
How about we do it again?
6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think I fallen.
Okay, let's try one more
I
time.
definitely.
Ready?
I can move you. Making review. Making review.
Say 6,
6,
5,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Rankin Reviewers, and welcome to a first of a two-part special episode of Rankin Review. Rankin Review versus Star Trek. For these two episodes, I have two guests, and they happen to be siblings, Jaron Francis and Paxton Francis. And I selected these two gentlemen not just because they're good friends of mine, but because they know their shit when it comes to Star Trek. It was about a year ago now we did a two-part episode on Star Wars. The first part being Nerd Rage, the second part being Nerd Love. You will find I'm less passionate when it comes to Star Trek. As a child, I always looked at Star Trek as kind of like the less cool little brother of Star Wars. I've grown a finer appreciation of it, but as I am not a card-carrying Trekkie, I invited two full-blown Star Trek nerds to participate. How full-blown? Well, we're going to need 2 episodes to get all of this done. But that's okay. It's sometimes good to roll up our sleeves and dig right into it. Now, all you Trekkies out there are probably going to want to have your voices heard. You can definitely do that by sending feedback to rankinreview@gmail.com. That's RANKNREVIEW@gmail.com. And everybody should be well aware of the fact that there will be spoilers and there will be coarse language throughout. We are going to look at the first 6 Star Trek films, those including the original cast from the original show. And without further ado, welcome as always to Rank and Review. All right, so gentlemen, I have 2 Francises with me for this episode of Rank and Review.
Franci,
if you would like it. We have Jaron Francis. We haven't heard from you since episode 25.
I'm back.
But he's back, damn it. And we have Paxton Francis, regular contributor. And today we're going to talk about Star Trek, specifically the 6 original cast films.
The real movies.
In the Star Trek, the real movies, say the fans on board. And I remember one of the first times I remember being in your parents' place when I first met you. And I noticed downstairs that there was this wall of VHSs of like original episodes of
Columbia
Star Trek.
House.
Yeah,
we were Columbia House members. We got a couple episodes in the mail once a month.
And I think you had a Star Trek t-shirt, so I knew you were into Star Trek. But when I saw the wall of Star Trek, I was like, oh no, this is like long term. This was bred into you.
Yeah,
So, like,
you knew I was...
yeah, this was real.
Yeah.
Because for me, my Star Trek affinity starts largely with The Next Generation. I mean, I watched these Star Trek films when I was a kid, and I liked them a lot. But, and I don't
Not so much the show, though?
I don't want to hurt any feelings, but at the time when I was a kid, I watched Star Trek to satiate myself because I was worn out from watching Star Wars, right? They were the other science fiction, action, adventure movies. But what I don't have a very strong affinity for is the original series.
Fair enough.
I haven't seen all of the episodes, to be honest, of the original series. I've seen probably, I'm going to say, maybe 60 to 70%. And I find them, like, kitschy almost to the point of like the Batman TV show, which was airing against it at the time.
It was its main competition at the time.
And was always killing it in the ratings.
Beating the pants off of it. All it was more expensive than Star Trek once they got into the later season. The last season of Trek was made really on the cheap.
Even when I was a kid, though, it sort of felt old and cheap to me. And I know that seems like a harsh words, but that's how I felt about Star Trek until the movies, basically.
So there's a reason why the aesthetic and the tone of the storytelling in the 6 movies we're about to talk about is a huge departure from the tone of the television show, because everybody associated with it, maybe except for Gene Roddenberry, realized how dorky the format was on TV.
Right.
I think
I
of
think
those.
even he did. Like
Yeah,
he
he
wrote the first movie, and it's the one that's
He
probably
co-wrote.
least like the TV show in terms of the energy.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was lost on him. I think
Harold
it was
Livingston
just
wrote
it was the
screenplay
necessity
for
of
the
its
first.
time, right? Like there were so many people other than him that were telling him you gotta make this sellable. You gotta make this. I mean, there's a reason the first pilot didn't get
But
picked up.
is the original series sacred text to you guys, or is it just something you love because you've loved it since you were kids?
It's not sacred text to me at all. I would say there are, of those original episodes, less than a dozen that I would say are really good pieces of television.
Right.
But there may be, like, if somebody wanted to know what the original series was about, I would have no problem paring the whole thing down to a half a dozen episodes and saying, now you have a good understanding of Star Trek.
I was gonna say
A
about
couple
half
really-
of season one. You could watch half of season one and get to really.
Yeah, you
sense of
do
it.
a couple action episodes, some of the really tense ones like the Doomsday Machine or Amok Time or Arena, right? And then some of the funnier episodes you might want to do. What's the time travel one with City on the Edge of Forever? Or
That's not funny.
No, it's not funny. It's
That's
one
the
of
most tragic episode of
It's
the
tragic.
series.
I jumped away from Trouble with Tribbles.
Right.
The funny time travel one is a piece of the action.
They don't. That's not time traveling. The Iosians just
That's right. It's
are very mimicking.
It's
so
a
their whole
current
society
planet.
becomes based on this 1920s like gangs
Chicago
of the 20s
gangster
novel or something.
history novel. They base their whole society
Yeah.
off of it in a century.
Right.
Yeah, that's not time travel-y.
We're
Right.
going to be back
Close
for our
enough.
piece of the action.
That's right.
Boo.
But there's this sort of interesting kitsch quality to that, and that you're right, it's winked at here and there in the movies, but is pretty much entirely gone.
Mhm.
And like for me, like the movies are really beloved, and I think deservedly so. But I think it's interesting how not like the TV show they are
Mhm.
really at all,
And better for it.
and better for it.
Way better.
Point in fact, there was talk before the motion picture happened of a very different take on Star Trek, where they were going to do Star Trek versus the Greek gods, Clash of the Titans style. They were going to somehow merge the popularity of things like Clash of the Titans and the Star Trek universe. It was put forth as an idea, I think, as a TV movie. Or
Whose
something.
idea was it?
I don't know all the specifics of this.
I mean,
but
it had already been linked in the television show. There's an episode where they meet Adonis. No,
They
no,
meet,
Apollo.
Apollo, yeah.
And like he's literally the being who was Apollo
Right.
here 3,000 years ago in ancient Greece.
And it
They
just
were
explains
worshiping
how
this
they had
being.
godlike powers. 'cause
And
they
all
were
of the
aliens.
Greek gods, they find the planet where they all live now.
It was proposed and outlined as, I believe, a TV movie, according to what I was reading last week. And like, that's where it could have gone. It could have gone that crazy and kitschy and been this sort of...
And instead, it waits until Star Trek V to do that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, though, like, what could... Again, it could have been... That arguably might have been closer to the authentic Star Trek movie as far as what people would expect from the TV show.
I'd be curious to see what we'd have had if instead of these 6 movies, we'd had a year or two of an ultimately failed, but maybe really good for a little while, Star Trek Phase 2.
Right.
With the original cast.
In the realm of what the first movie was in terms of tone and timeline and that kind of thing.
That's right. I mean, the original movie started off as a teleplay for Star Trek Phase 2.
Right.
They mined some
Even
of the teleplays for that.
some of the sets that they built and stuff were actually built for Phase 2 before it got junked.
Yeah, because you mentioned it. We'll talk about it when we get to the review. But Alan Dean Foster wrote the story for the motion picture. I think it was his script for a Phase 2 episode.
Really?
That's what Wikipedia
Well, we'll talk
says.
about it.
Screenplay by Harold Livingston, story by Alan Dean Foster.
Talk about how off the rails. Like the original, I've read the original climax of Roddenberry's first script for the movie that was rejected. It ended with Kirk having a fist fight on the bridge with Jesus.
Oh, wow.
So it was a time travel story, I'm guessing. Although
Does
Again,
does
maybe
fight-
Jesus just showed up.
Yeah.
Again, they waited for Star Trek V to have
Does
Kirk
it start
battle a
by saying-
Judeo-Christian entity.
Yeah, does he start by saying, why would Jesus need a spaceship?
Yeah. Maybe he didn't.
Uh,
So I guess you guys already covered it. There's a handful of episodes you would say essentials, but any best and worsts out of the original series that are worth mentioning to the other Trekkies listening, or to the would-be Trekkies who might want to dabble their feet?
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple really strong. All the strongest ones, or most of the strongest ones, are in season 1. Oddly, and I don't know if they just got beholden
Balance
to
of
ratings
Terror.
or what. Balance of Terror is really strong.
That's the first appearance of the Romulans, where the actor who would later, Mark Leonard, who would later play Spock's father through all of these movies, and in the original series. He originally played a Romulan commander, and he and Kirk go toe-to-toe in what's ostensibly just a submarine battle episode.
Right.
Yeah, it's
but it's
basically
really
what's
tense.
that famous submarine movie from the 50s?
Or from the 50s. Oh,
Silent
Run
Running?
Silent, Run Deep. Run Silent, Run Deep.
Yeah, it's basically that, except on
In
the ship,
space.
which they borrowed heavily from for
I mean,
the con.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's more not. Yeah, it's a destroyer versus submarine battle, right?
Right.
Because the Romulans can cloak, the Enterprise can't.
Yeah.
It's basically just a World War II destroyer submarine.
And you get
hunt.
both sides of the
Well, and-
the battle just equally.
And the
you know,
mutual
like-
respect between commanders. That's
Yeah,
one
like
of
it's
the key
tragic when they
episodes.
kill the bad
Like
guys
if you
at the
said top 3 episodes people should see if they watch the original series, I'd probably say Balance of Terror, Amok Time, the one where Spock goes into his mating frenzy and has the fight to quote unquote to the death with Kirk at the end with the crazy Vulcan weapons, the
Woon, the Lirpa, and then City on the Edge of Forever. I think.
Probably with Joan
Top
Collins, where they travel back in time and they have to let her die in order for Hitler to not
Well,
win
they
World War
don't.
II.
It's
But
right at the
generally
end of the
speaking,
first
it's
season.
the seriously themed episodes that are the good ones. Then is sort of what I'm hearing.
I think they just give the best of what the show could do, and
Right.
give the strongest sense of why the characters are compelling. Episodes like Trouble with Tribbles, I love, but there's nothing about them that you can completely excise and still have the essentials of why the characters are great.
Yeah.
Yeah, episodes like that are fun. A piece of the action is fun, that sort of thing. And the other time travel one I was thinking of is when they end up in low Earth orbit in the late 60s and this
Yeah.
jet scramble after them. I don't remember.
Tomorrow
what
is
it's-
Yesterday?
Tomorrow is Yesterday. That's the one.
Nerd.
But yeah, certain episodes really illustrate the chemistry well too between the characters. Galileo 7 is a good one if you want a
Yeah,
good
that's a great
understanding
one.
of Spock's character. Where
Spock's first command.
Spock has to lead the mission when they're stranded on some uncharted planet that turns out to be inhabited by these like 8 or 9 foot tall proto-human like cavemen with huge, they throw spears and rocks at them, and they're trying to fix the shuttlecraft while fending off this attack, and Spock's got to make some really hard decisions and come
And
face
people
to
keep
face.
dying, and he's baffled by how, because
Yeah,
he's so logical.
every
He
step
should
of
be
the
able to
way
save
he's
everybody.
made the logical decision, and he's butting
But
up
it's
against
wrong.
the fact that that doesn't matter. He's
Sometimes
still-
the real world gets in the way.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which, ironically enough, Kirk doesn't even fully learn that lesson until the second movie, which we'll talk about when we get there. It's sort of Spock's Kobayashi Maru. He sacrifices them all at the end on a big gamble, and it just happens
Yeah.
to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's
He
one of
meets
the
the
interesting things about
Vince
James
the
T.
Plasma.
Kirk. I love me William Shatner, and I do think he's actually a legit actor, but there is something make fun ofable about
Yeah.
the Shat. Whenever I would do my improv shows, or we're putting together a cast to do a show, I would have a strict no shatning in this show. If you're going too far, I will tell you, right? And he has this reputation for being big, but I think that was one of the things that I liked about rewatching these movies is actually growing. Well, I mean, I always knew it was there, but reminding myself that the Shat can act, and
Yep.
he can.
He can
act.
shack anyway.
He's in
And
a
it's-
lot of ways like a living cliche, but he had some game, and I respect that.
Part of it might be that he's got his sense of humor and his sense of wanting to be entertaining is such that he makes fun of himself a lot. He's allowed himself to become a cartoon version of William
It was
Shatner.
like his third act. That's the third act of his career.
Yeah,
It was like being a
is
parody
being
of
a
himself.
Priceline parody of William Shatner. And even when he was on Boston Legal winning awards, he was playing
Bill
William
Shatner.
Shatner parody.
Yeah, I remember it being written somewhere
It's like
that
Rodney Dangerfield.
he does the best Bill Shatner in the business.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody's better.
Exactly.
But he also, I do think it would be interesting to go back and watch him play Hamlet at Stratford or something and just see how his talent stacked up before he had the huge fame, right?
You can listen to
I'm sure
To Be or Not to Be on the Transformed Man whenever you want.
Yeah, but that was recorded after he was all...
It was recorded in '68, yeah.
Yeah, he was all big-headed already. He was already doing readings of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on live TV and thinking people should listen to him and be happy to hear it for some reason.
Drink it in, people.
Actually, it's not Lucy in the Sky that's as bad as the other one.
Mr. Tambourine
They're
Man.
all
Mr.
horrible,
Tambourine
yeah.
Man is the worst
That
one.
wins.
But as much hell as the Shat catches for that stuff,
Bilbo Baggins.
The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins by Leonard Nimoy is wow. Anybody listening who doesn't know what we're talking about, you should Google what I just
Or
said.
just count yourself lucky.
We'll try not to let
Yeah,
it
maybe
overtake
that.
it, but I don't mind hearing a little bit through the course of the reviews too about the weird dick measuring thing that seemed to be going on between Nimoy and Shatner through these movies.
Mhm.
But
No, really big. I mean, you have two cultural icons who were, right from the beginning of the time they worked together, competitive with one another because they were, right? Not really?
Well, from this, I've read a lot of books by both of them.
I know,
and
you're a total
It's
loser.
really a one-way contest. Even Shatner admits to that now.
Yeah.
That
I was the
the
asshole.
contest
Shatner's in a
really
one-way
only existed
contest with
early
everyone.
in the process. Like
Right.
during the first season in particular, they really were at odds a lot, and it was because all the positive fan response
was
was
going
about
to
Spock.
Nimoy.
Yeah.
And Nimoy didn't
And
really give a
Shatner's-
shit, which made it
Shatner's
even
the main
more,
guy, right? He's supposed to be the headliner.
Right.
Yeah.
He was the pretty face, the
Meanwhile, Nimoy's
the hero.
making the cover of all the magazines. Nimoy was the huge sex symbol who had to like sneak out of restaurants through the back door, otherwise he'd be mobbed. By
he would get
women.
invites to go to appearances and Shatner wouldn't and that kind of thing. And once they resolved that, once Shatner had a chat with Roddenberry and basically told him, you just got to calm down about it, man. Like you're on a good show.
Yeah. Everybody's winning here.
This could get canceled next season for all you know. Like just enjoy it. And he did, and then it just kind of gradually went away, and they became best buddies.
He seemed to learn that lesson of just enjoy it because I mean he went on to make T.J. Hooker and Rescue 911 and then a decade of Priceline commercials, and he didn't seem upset by any of that one iota.
And Roddenberry proved right too, because after the show went off the air after season 3, Shatner went back to doing like summer stock theater with his dog, living in his truck with his dog and that kind of thing. And I think that's probably why he later in his career really did appreciate the easy money of something like Priceline.
Yeah.
Because
Go
it doesn't
into
get
an
that good for
afternoon of
most
work
actors.
and make $500,000, $1 million for one ad.
Yeah.
One more thing I want to get into, and then we should start reviewing these movies. But for me, if it came down to this terrible crucible where you had to choose between Star Wars and Star Trek, I would probably choose Star Wars. I wouldn't be happy about it. I would choose Star Wars. But
Really? I'm not surprised at all. I would have guessed you'd be Star Wars for sure.
I would need to hear more about the parameters of this before I can choose.
Well, if you could only have one thing, you could for the rest of your life, you could either watch Star Trek shit or Star Wars.
Now, is the other one wiped from existence for everyone, or just I can't ever see it again personally?
For you personally, I guess,
Yeah,
for the
okay.
sake of this argument.
Fair enough.
Anyway, yeah, you're not eradicating it. You're not eradicating it for everybody else as well.
There you go.
You would have to
That's
miss
my
out on something. But that's interesting, the parallels and basically the opposite that happens simultaneously with this. Like, I find that Star Wars is a very World War II aerial sort of aesthetic to the action, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Star Trek, as we mentioned, is much more of the submarine battles,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where there's the more suspension, more sort of battle of wills.
The stakes are put at the forefront, and the dynamics are in the background, sort of.
And so it's similar but different. And then I like that Star Wars is for the most part a pretty nihilistic universe in a lot of ways. The universe is always the power struggles being wrestled with, planets are being exploded, and the portrayal of the future that Gene Roddenberry puts forth with Star Trek is very positive in a lot of ways. Not that there isn't terrible shit in it, but where we are as a people seems to have progressed in a very positive way.
Most of the terrible shit was injected from outside of Roddenberry, but go on.
Well, that's
I digress.
Basically, the future in Star Wars is that we're still fighting each other over petty power issues.
Well,
and we're not getting along to explore the universe.
I take issue with you saying it's in the future.
Yeah, it's
Larry.
in a long time
It's
ago.
long ago. I apologize.
It's fine.
Nerds. But, But you see what I'm saying? Like, I think that there's a percentage of, even though Star Wars is a very fun universe, there's much more nihilism in Star Wars, and there's much more hope in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that I think I really, really lock into and like about Star Trek personally, is that it's a much more hopeful thing.
I agree. Yeah, it's.
Do you want an answer on this now?
Well, if you can give it. I mean, I know it's like it's a crucible.
No, mine's really an easy answer, but you were, sorry, I interrupted you.
Before I gave an answer on that, I was just going to say there's also not just a hopefulness, but Star Trek is a little bit more meritocratus. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's upward mobility in Star Trek. There's hope for the individual too, right? In Star Wars, you're either born a dirt farmer, or you happen to be the 1 in a billion dirt farmer who's Luke Skywalker, right? And everybody's royalty. There's a caste system. There's no bettering of human beings. Like you said, everything's been the same way it is for 10,000 years. It's very medieval and feudal in that way. Star Trek is about...
We don't have money. We don't have...
It's about personal enlightenment. It's about society becoming more enlightened and more advanced and more evolved and getting to address the bigger problems and questions, and instead of, do I have enough schmeckles to pay for the rent this month?
Yeah.
Right?
And if you work really hard and make it all important, you can be James T. Kirk and run a starship.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can be a Ferengi holographic pimp and run a bar on a space station. You can do whatever you want.
It sounds pretty sweet.
Sounds pretty sweet.
Star Trek also has the distinction of feeling much more genuinely like science fiction to me than Star Wars, where Star Wars is much more
feels
space
plausible,
fantasy, right?
Yeah.
And there's, allegories, unsubtle allegories. I remember an original series episode where the planets where people are white on half of their bodies and black on the other, and whether it's the left or right side is the whole racial, really subtly snuck in there.
Yeah.
Right? but,
I think that's a third season episode. Probably.
They're still like attempting to, there's a moral, they're making a statement about where we're going, or
There's also an attempt to link it to reality. There's no magic in Star Trek. There's Star Trek is also overtly atheistic, even in the 60s version of the show. Anytime they run into a being that calls itself a god, right? Like,
it's
humanist. It's humanist. I would say that compared to the rest of 1960s culture, that was about as much atheism as you could put on TV.
As you could get on TV.
Is the notion that you would run into a super being that actually was Apollo, and you would go, oh yeah, gods, and roll your eyes.
There was a time when that was a thing.
There was a time when people believed in such nonsense.
People used to just slit each other's throats for money, and now we don't have money.
So did you answer which?
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Well, no, I wasn't going. I said I wanted to say before I get to our answer.
Oh, okay.
You said you were ready with your answer. You
I know. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss it.
Okay. No,
well,
ahead.
since you mentioned the atheism / humanism side of Star Trek, I'll maybe touch on that. The reason it's an easy decision for me is because Star Trek is a huge reason why I am the way I am. Star Wars is not.
Right.
I've been rewatching TNG, while I exercise and that kind of thing lately, and I watched the episode The Outcast from season 4, and you probably won't remember what it's about. It's about a society with no gender.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Riker
fertilized in these
course.
Yeah, Riker falls in love.
First things fucking last, ladies and gentlemen. Riker fucks.
Just remember, every exit is also an entry.
That's right.
He falls for a genderless thing that prefers gender. It feels female.
Right.
And in their society, that's frowned upon. Like, you get sent off to a hospital and they redo your brain and fix you,
right.
and you're all the happier for it when it's done. So of course it ends tragically because he tries to bust her out, and by the time he gets to her, they've redone her brain and they can't be together. And she gives this impassioned speech at one point about, and it's obviously about homosexuality. This was early 90s. That was
Don't
a
Ask,
huge
Don't
issue.
Tell was a big issue.
Yeah.
Clinton was just passing it when that was written, yeah.
It was a huge deal. And I would have been 11 probably when it aired. So that was completely lost on me. But I remember being so frustrated by when she talks about how, my love is no less than your love.
Yeah.
And the episode had a huge effect on me, even though I didn't know what it was actually about. I haven't seen it somehow since then. So I watched it the other day, and realized that that aspect of Star Trek is probably hugely responsible for why I am empathetic the way I am in life, why I take so easily to things like that I've seen through metaphor, and I'm certain that that's shaped me, you know, because I watched that shit out of Star Trek when I was, from the time I was probably 6 or 7, our dad was showing it to us. And then TNG ran until I was a teenager.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I have no doubt that that's a big reason why I am the way I am.
So Star Trek.
Star Wars was just fun.
Yeah.
We were
So
watching
by
Star
comparison,
Trek.
it's-
We were watching Star Trek when I was 6 or 7, so you were 3 or 4.
Yeah, before I could remember.
I thought you were going to say that episode was a huge influence on why you have decided to become genderless or something. I was starting to brace myself for some big news here, Jim.
No, but being that, you know, the people that I have in my life, that maybe has more meaning to me than some people that issue isn't important to. And then also you touched on the atheism thing. I'm an atheist,
right?
And I guarantee it's because I watched Star Trek.
Oh, really?
Because
You
that
attribute Star Trek to that as well?
that worldview, that life view, that philosophy, makes sense to me because of how it made sense in the terms that it's laid out in Star Trek.
I would
the idea of
Star Trek with
prioritizing humanity over yourself, like the goals for what makes humanity flourish rather than just what makes me flourish.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't say that my atheism is due to Star Trek, but it certainly Star Trek helped breed an environment in which my personal age of reasoning came at like 11, when I just sort of figured out that the biblical stories made no sense, and more importantly, the modern teachings of the
that they were
church
just
were
stories.
antithetical to sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much the Bible's not real as the things my youth group leader and minister are telling me are strange and beyond strange, to the point where if they're true, I want nothing to do with this God asshole, because he sounds like sort of
like
a knob. Yeah.
So Star Trek versus Star Wars, before we get into super deep into philosophical territory.
I would take Star Trek,
Yeah.
even though pound for pound, because if you just count the good 3 theatrical Star Wars movies,
Yeah.
see, there's where you go. You take all the canon or old canon of Star Wars, whatever, all the movies, cartoons. There's a lot of Star Wars too,
Yeah.
but there are 4 good movies,
Yeah.
and the rest of it's more or less disposable. Some of the
By the time this
stuff is
airs,
okay.
there might be 5.
Whereas there's got to be pushing 1,000 hours of Star Trek television.
Well, there'd be more than that, because there's 79 original series, 200 and some or almost 200 episodes of Next Gen.
Another 200 and
another
some
200 of
DS9.
DS9. Almost 200 of
But those are like
Voyager.
46 minutes each. We're getting close to 1,000 hours, is what I'm saying. I
But then all the
looked
animated
it up, but
series.
we can
the
maybe
movies.
look it up and get back to you with an exact number of hours of extant Star
I'm
Trek.
curious
But
now.
there's
But before I forget, I
Novels.
earlier said, "Oh yeah, Clinton was writing Don't Ask, Don't Tell" when that episode was. That episode, if it was season 4, would have been 91.
91 or
George
2.
Bush Sr. was president, so I
Yeah.
obviously don't know what I was talking about. But I wanted to correct that myself.
I forgive you.
There you go.
So we have 2 for Star Trek, 1 for Star Wars.
Yes!
I guess Star Trek wins. Is there anything you guys want to say by way of introduction before we get into Star Trek the Motion Picture?
I'll just finish that. What I was starting to say was that pound for pound, those 3 movies are really enjoyable. You know how much I love Star Wars,
Of
right? We've
course.
talked about Star Wars. I have apparently, Larry told me, the honor of the longest single rank and review when I railed against the Phantom Menace for like 46 minutes.
I'm not
or something.
surprised.
For the length of a full episode of Star
I
Trek.
feel like I've
railed
heard the
against
review probably 7 times.
Yeah,
the,
you
the
maybe
equivalent
have.
of it.
You maybe have.
So, yeah.
But no, in way of introduction, I love Star Trek. I love these movies. I particularly love the core of them, which I consider to be 2, 3, 4. We'll be talking about that as we go, and again at the end, I'm sure. But I feel like finally all of this potential that was there in the world that Roddenberry had created for the television series came along, and the right producers got their hands on it, and they finally definitely cracked the code of how to make great Star Trek.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Cool beans.
Just for the record, the 6 Star Trek movies we're going to review is Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, and Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. No notes. That all came out of my brain.
Woot!
Travel forward with us, 300 years into the future, to confront the greatest mystery ever to threaten mankind. We are aboard a huge starship called the Enterprise. This is the return of Captain Kirk.
An alien object of unbelievable destructive power is less than 3 days away from this planet.
Mr. Spock,
I offer my services as science officer.
Dr. McCoy, Scotty, and joining them on their mission, Commander Will Decker and Navigator Ilea.
I'm sorry.
That you left Delta 4? Or that you didn't even say goodbye?
So say what you will about Star Trek: The Motion Picture, they definitely rolled out Hollywood's red carpet for Star Trek. Robert Wise was not some random pick. Robert Wise was a pedigreed director. He's responsible for one of my favorite classic horror movies, The Haunting, the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Big fan.
Fantastic.
Andromeda Strain.
Yeah.
West Side Story.
West Side Story is a
Oscar
huge
winner for
musical,
that.
Best Picture winner. This guy is no slouch. But just because you're an amazing director doesn't necessarily mean that you were born to do a Star Trek
Or that
movie.
you've ever seen it.
Well, my impression, and again, I come in as not a fan, is that this guy saw 2001 and sort of said, me too. Right? Like, he wanted to make a beautiful science fiction epic spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And since they were consciously changing the tone of the movie, of the original TV show, pardon me, that seemed like the right direction to go. And in true to form, especially when you take a TV show to a film, you have to up the stakes. It's no longer just one adventure on the bridge of the Enterprise. The world is at stake. Everything has to get bigger. So I get the intention, but I will admit that I found the pace of this to be very, very slow, and that I was confused and maybe even irritated by the fact that, frankly, the two main characters of the movies are none of the main characters of the core cast of Star Trek. I suffer from insomnia. I have a really hard time sleeping most of the time. And we watched Star Trek: The Motion Picture at my friend's house, at Paxton's house, where we're recording this now. And for the last 20 minutes of this movie,
Could not keep your eyes open.
I was having a real fucking hard time keeping my eyes open. And I rewatched it again at home because I wanted to get clarity.
Okay, good, because the last 20 minutes is the movie.
That's the, yeah.
Right?
There had been some whiskey drinking, and if I recall, the thermostat was
It
pretty
was-
high.
it was
in
hot
here.
in here.
Swelteringly hot.
It was hot, that's true.
But you'd also watch 2 hours of Star Trek 1, which is a...
I don't fall asleep during movies,
It's like
and
a
I don't
sleeping
fall
pill.
asleep in other people's houses. Like, it was pretty unprecedented. And I watched it again, like I said, at my house. I felt a little dopey while I was watching it, but in the interest of being brutally honest, I would at this point only recommend Star Trek: The Motion Picture as a sleep aid. I don't have a lot of affection for it. I mean, there is, the Enterprise porn that we talked about when we watched the movie, where you get the slow pan around the Enterprise.
Yep.
And if I grew up loving the Enterprise,
Then you'd give a shit.
then I would give a shit. But I just wanted them to get to the ship. No. I like what they were going for. I like the presentation, but this doesn't feel like Star Trek to me. It just doesn't.
Well, they're not on a trek yet.
So,
through
I didn't
There is a
mention the
reason.
plot, but I think I've mentioned enough that I can safely put this blood-soaked ball in your guys'
Sure.
Fair enough. Now, just let me frame this for a second. It's 1979.
8. Wasn't it 8?
It was released in 79.
Oh, okay.
There is a whole generation of people who grew up 10 years earlier watching Star Trek. VHSs don't exist. The reruns were in syndication, but people hadn't seen Star Trek for a long time. There was a nation of people out there who grew up loving the Enterprise and wanted to see it on the screen. So, I know you don't feel that way, but There was
A
a
lot of
reason,
people did.
There's a reason that movie made more money than any other Star Trek movie to date. Right, adjusted for modern day by a long shot, right? A lot of people wanted to go see that movie. A lot of people didn't want to go see it again, but they wanted to see it the first time because they wanted to see the Enterprise. Secondly, we watched, in preparation for this review, the director's cut,
which is longer.
That huge, long, sleep-inducing section where they're flying into the gas cloud is 11 minutes
There's about
longer.
12 minutes of footage in the movie
that was rightfully on the cutting room floor when it first hit the wall.
So I typically wouldn't have seen that unless we were watching the deluxe edition.
And it's possible
we treated you to the longer version.
Thank you.
And it's debatable. I maybe regret that decision, because if we're stacking the movies and we're specifically not talking, we got into this when we did Apocalypse Now Redux, where it altered my position. My ranking was affected by the fact that we were rating the Redux version and not the real version.
Well, I can credit this as the director's cut, so there's no confusion amongst the trophies.
It would probably change my rank. That extra 11 minutes of footage might. I don't know. It would depend on the day.
It wouldn't for me, because like I said, this movie exists in the last 15-20 minutes of the screenplay.
But it's over 2 hours.
But you have to sit there to get there, right?
Yeah.
Literally, the movie's 2 hours and 25 minutes or something, right? Or is it 2 hours and 15?
It's 2 hours too long.
So you guys are on board with this. Like, I don't mean to be super mean about it, and like I say, I praise the ambition, and it was like, at the time, the idea of these space scopes and these like scenes of spaceships were not as commonplace in theaters as we see now. I said the same thing when we talked about 2001, all those slow pans over the spaceships. I think when you were first sitting down in the theater, when it was a brand new movie, you'd be drooling over that shit. And we're not as impressed by that now. I think that part of the problem might just be time itself. But
part of the problem is somebody who has done a lot of editing. That movie, most of the pacing problems of that movie could be solved by re-editing it. I bet there are some fan edits of the motion picture that are far more digestible. And one of the big problems with the movie, and why it is on the bottom end of all of three of our lists, I'm sure when we get there it'll be toward the bottom end of the list for everybody, is that it isn't a movie script, right? Jaron, you said it has elements of Gene Roddenberry's script that wasn't even originally a Star Trek script.
It was a film feature script. He just tried to sell it as something else.
Yeah, and it also has elements of a script that was written for Phase 2, the proposed but failed CBS revival show that they were going to do a new run where the Enterprise was on a new 5-year mission. And my understanding is that the episode that was going to be the pilot for that was taken. The Decker character, the one who's sort of in competition with Kirk for command of the Enterprise, was he to be the new captain or a new first officer for Kirk?
I don't know the specifics.
He comes out
of
one of the scripts. Several of those older scripts and characters were mine to make this movie that ends up feeling like there's enough story with the whole V'ger, right? We haven't outlined the plot, but there's enough story there to fill a 45-minute episode of television, and it's 2 hours and 12 minutes long.
The plot is basically a familiar thing, especially when we're talking about the movies. A heretofore unknown but ultra-powerful force shows up out of nowhere from the universe, seeming to demand or need something, and there's a riddle that needs to be solved, and everybody's
and the Enterprise is the only ship in the quadrant.
And we have. I can't even. Here's a bad sign. What's the name of the main character? The guy who's just been put in charge.
Captain Decker.
Decker. Yeah. Again, I can't even keep the guy's name in it. Like, he to me is the main character of this movie. His arc is probably the most full of any of the characters. He and this bald chick.
His beginning and his end constitute more of a journey, I think, than Kirk's arc, certainly.
Anyone. And that decision for me is confusing. I think that you guys talking about the fact that it was mined from a different screenplay might actually crack the code on that for me, because they couldn't kill Kirk, right? So they couldn't put Kirk in that role.
Well, and there's stuff in this screenplay to give you an idea of how there were poor decisions made throughout the making of the movie as far as what to cut and what not to cut. They shoot all of this V'ger footage where they're flying through the being, and meanwhile there are interesting little character details about Decker that don't make it to the screen. Decker is the son of Kirk's best friend, or one of his close friends, Commodore Decker,
who's in the show.
He's a character in one of the best episodes of the series called The Doomsday Machine. And Decker, Commodore Decker, ends up, after having some faltering courage, very selflessly sacrificing himself to save the Enterprise, etc., etc.
Well, not really.
Well,
he sort of dies in disgrace after his whole crew is marooned on a planet and dies.
He at least attempts to die courageously, and he
Yeah,
teaches
he
them
just
a
fails.
lesson of how to kill the thing without inadvertently.
Yes.
Solves the riddle for them. That's by the wayside. Anyway, that sort of thing might help Decker make sense to a viewer. Is like, okay, so this is the son of Kirk's old friend. That's all you need to know. That would take 2 seconds to inject that into the movie, and suddenly we might understand a bit more about why Decker's
But
even
instead,
there in the
12
first
minutes
place.
of flashy lights and mist and more lights.
Well, and that feels like at least a little wiggle of fan service. And like I know that you can overdo fan service, but basically we have the characters from the original Star Trek TV show in an adventure unlike anything that they've ever been in before, to which they were supporting players in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They get the beginnings of
Except
arcs,
for Spock.
but they don't really get to finish them.
Yeah.
Like at the beginning of the movie, Kirk's wrestling with old age, feeling like he's over the hill. That's potentially interesting for a character.
But he doesn't get that story arc really until Star Trek II when it starts.
It's reintroduced in exactly the same way.
But they decide
in
to
Star
actually
Trek
follow
II,
it
but
through.
it goes to the end of the film.
As is so often the case with Star Trek, the only core character of the main trio of Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Spock is a main character in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Right? V'ger speaks to him across time and space. He comes back from his Vulcan studies and rejects all Vulcan philosophy because he has to go and talk to this he realizes, like, I have feelings about this. I can't accept this honor of completing
and the
this
plot
training because look, I'm having feelings about this being across the galaxy and I have to go chase that. And he actually has a character journey. He dies and is reborn in a certain way, or just about dies, where he faces infinity. All of these things happen to Spock, and all Kirk does really is have a cock measuring contest with a guy who ends up dying.
Stand around. And Spock also, the climax turns on Spock's understanding of V'ger. And as was common in the TV show, his strengths, it all sort of comes to bear for Kirk to then decide what to do.
Right.
So
probably the best scene in the movie is Spock in recovery after he's encountered and mind melded with V'ger, and he's just waking up and Kirk is talking to him in sickbay, and Spock is very emotional. He's smiling and laughing, and the interesting thing about that scene is that, is it you who told me this, Jen?
I don't know.
Nimoy and Shatner made that decision for Spock to be emotional there together.
Oh,
they
really?
didn't. Yeah, well, Wise didn't know fucking dick about the characters, right? He hadn't watched Star Trek before he got the job.
Yeah, they would get together in their trailer and like decide how to change the script.
And Nimoy and Kirk were bored, and I think Nimoy and Shatner, I think they realized they were making an utterly boring movie that didn't have anything to do with Kirk and Spock, and they're like, we can have this interesting little arc between the two of them where Spock's eyes are open to the whole universe for a minute, and his reaction is very emotional, which makes sense because Spock's half human. He spends most of his energy repressing emotion. Right? He's the most repressed guy ever.
He realizes how lucky he is to be able to have access to emotion, whether he chooses to deny it or not. It's within his ability.
And all of that stuff
that
is
makes
about
him
3
stronger.
layers under the surface of what is more or less a boring movie. But to finish up the plot synopsis, we never finish. We get to the end, the super being that's threatening the Earth turns out to be Voyager 6, which right now is an Earth probe that gets sent out in our time or in the late 20th century.
Yeah, there was no Voyager 6.
There was no Voyager 6, but Voyager is right now leaving the solar system as we speak. It's the furthest object from here. And in '79, it was assumed, I suppose, that the Voyager program
would
continue.
have a bunch.
Yeah, that's right. So we sent this machine out. It encountered a race of machines, became super intelligent, and came home to contact its creator, which
to return all that information.
That's right. And in trying to complete its mission, threatens to wipe out human civilization.
But they don't.
Then Decker fucks the probe, and it has a giant space orgasm.
Everything up till that
happy.
point in the movie is basically the same concept I forget the name of the episode, but there's an episode in the original series that's basically that same thing. This probe that has collected all the data it possibly
can. It's called the Changeling.
Is that the one?
Yeah.
And it wants to return the information.
Yeah.
So they just sort of grabbed that, but
made it bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, and then added on what doesn't happen in that episode, as far as I recall, where they have this theoretical exploration of what a machine life form is missing that would allow it to continue to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty hokey, but Kirk's like, what V'ger needs is a human quality, our ability to leap beyond logic.
It's trying to learn.
So
it's a child.
that's why it wants to merge with its creators, so that it can be more than just what it is, and be able to explore dimensions and keep learning and blah blah blah.
It recognizes that one of the things that the carbon units, which is what it calls us, one of the things that the carbon units do is to merge with one another, and it feels the need to merge in order to... It understands everything else in the universe except what it means to become one with some other being.
Right.
So it wants to do that. It wants to get jiggy with it. Now, if you need any final nail in the coffin of why Decker shouldn't be in the movie, is at the end, like I said, he solves the problem by joining physically with V'ger's avatar. V'ger creates this human out of... Ilea is a lieutenant on the Enterprise who's introduced because, God forbid, we use a character from Star Trek,
exactly.
right? We better introduce some new ones. She's kidnapped by V'ger, made into his avatar and his sort of probe. And we interact with V'ger through her, and so do all of the crew members. Decker wins by fucking Ilea.
Yeah.
Why isn't that Kirk? That's what Kirk does, right?
Because
he
by
fucks
this
his way
point...
across the galaxy. Is my point? Is that here you have Star Trek being solved with some chivalry and a deep dickin', and
by
it's
this
not Kirk
point,
doing it.
They
Roddenberry
couldn't kill Kirk, right? They probably in their hearts wanted a franchise, and the whole thing would be incredibly different if they started the show by killing off Kirk.
I'm not saying they should kill Kirk. I'm just saying Kirk didn't even get to do any James Bonding. He didn't get to have any love making.
The only
Decker
real
got
contribution he makes to the whole movie is at the end. He's the one who says what V'ger needs is this human quality.
And Decker
he wants to merge.
And
so
he
then
is
Decker
throughout
says,
the
"Well,
original
like
series.
Ilea, I'll go merge with her."
And Kirk throughout the original series is the voice saying that in the classic cock versus Spurk, Kirk versus Spock dynamic of human versus logic, right?
Yeah, they all become
Heart
greater
versus
than the sum of their parts.
That's right, and Kirk is always arguing that it's human flaws that make humans
that will win the day,
able to do the thing, blah blah blah, and that's Roddenberry's philosophy all over the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hey, it works. It makes for some good TV and for some.
It
better
saves
movies.
the day at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
I keep going back to the 2001 influence. That's what I kind of feel like this was trying to be a loftier, true blue sci-fi Star Trek.
It was certainly an overt repudiation of the zippy, Star Warsy, flying around and, really high...
wasn't much of a trek.
They wanted to blow your mind. They didn't want to necessarily just blow shit up.
They recognized that one of the things that people loved about the original series was that it was intellectual sometimes. It wasn't always intellectual. And sometimes when it tried to be intellectual, it was stupid. The episode you mentioned where they run into the beings who are...
half black and half
white. Yeah,
white.
it's basically... Sneetches? Is that the doctor's
Yellow-bellied Sneetches.
It's basically Sneetches in space.
Yeah.
And other times when it tries to be high-minded, you get some, pretty incredible stuff in Star Trek.
I think that the pendulum was just sort of swinging to the other extreme. We have the crazy, wacky extreme of the TV show to the sort of more moderate, sort of serious sci-fi of the motion picture. Mm-hmm. Halfway, I think we're going to meet in the middle when we come to part 2.
I think
neither Star Trek nor Star Wars are science fiction, personally. You said that you have a hard time putting Star Wars in the science fiction camp. I say Star Wars is clearly just space fantasy. Right. It might as well be Lord of the Rings. It's just set in space with ships instead of riding around on wolves and swords, all of that sort of thing. Star Trek is... Well, the show in particular was pitched as Wagon Train to the Stars, and that's what it is. It's a space western with elements of sci-fi hidden in it, because there was no way to overtly put science fiction on TV.
But generally what I like about Star Trek is that they sneak the sci-fi in. I mean, yeah, we're about explosions, but we might sneakily try to blow your mind underneath.
Yeah. There's definitely sci-fi in Star Trek, but there's almost no science fiction in Star Wars. Star Trek, though, is just sort of a matrix in which sometimes good sci-fi stories are told, and other times they're just very, especially by the time we get to the next generation, but even in the early stories, they're often just fairly simple morality tales, right? Or allegorical stories, right? That sort of thing.
In the end, it's a huge universe, really. It can be used to tell any kind of story, but typically I associate it more with sci-fi. I know that we're going to get into much more familiar sort of action space territory right away here, but it feels more sci-fi somehow to me than Star Wars ever will.
There was no staff of writers, right? They took submissions from all sorts of people, and so you can almost look at the original series as like a weekly sci-fi magazine where people I'm sure a lot of writers took concepts they had for other stories and rewrote them to use Star Trek characters. And so, depending on the writer, some weeks you would have a really sci-fi heavy episode, and some weeks you'd have Balance of Terror that was a submarine fight in space. And it was a great episode, but there's no science fiction happening. It's just happening in space.
It just happens to be,
Yeah.
Is there anything else you guys want to say about the motion picture?
Yeah, I just want to throw out my theory for why it is terrible.
Okay. I was expecting more fight back in this, so I'm actually kind of happy.
I think it's
terrible in context.
Star Trek
of these
has
6 movies. But.
Star Trek, even now, like in the rebooted universe that exists in cinemas, sadly, it's most terrible when it's trying to serve masters outside of what everyone who's created good Star Trek knows makes it the best, which is the characters,
right?
The chemistry, the utilizing the characters in the way that they've already been proven to be best used.
Right.
And this movie is guilty of completely disregarding that for the most part.
Kirk, Spock, McCoy have like 2 scenes,
and when they do, the movie comes to life a little bit, barely.
Yeah.
Like they do their best, but the stuff they have to say is ridiculous.
And even then, it only comes to life for people who already know and care about the characters. Somebody who'd never seen Star Trek,
it gets reanimated.
Those scenes are not going to go, oh, this is getting interesting. Those scenes get interesting because we know those characters and because those
we
actors
just stop falling
talented.
Asleep at that point while we watch it.
We're like, oh, this chemistry is this reminds me of Star Trek or something.
These are the people we came here to see.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point because I feel like it's very, like the same could be said for why the new movies are terrible as well.
Beyond the darkness, beyond the human evolution, is Khan, a genetically superior tyrant. Exiled to a barren planet, banished by a starship commander he is destined to destroy. Left for dead, he has survived.
I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up. There she is. There she is.
Shield's collapsing, Captain. Can you give me phaser power? A few shots, sir.
Not enough against their shields.
The base is stubborn.
Scotty, I need warp speed in 3 minutes or we're all dead. I've done far worse than kill you. I've hurt you. And I wish to go on hurting you. I shall leave you as you left me. Marooned for all eternity. Buried alive. Buried alive. Sean!
So Star Trek the Motion Picture was a financial success. I mean, I think that
the biggest of any of them.
The critics were split on it. The fans tended to lean to my side, but the movie does have its defenders. But I think that everybody, maybe silently behind the scenes, might have agreed that they strayed a little too far from formula. And like I said in the previous review, I think Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is sort of this pendulum swinging back the other way. So much so that they mined their villain from the original series. Chekhov, who is a
Which
member,
they should have done for the first movie.
Yeah. Chekhov, who's now a member of a different crew, goes down on an away mission, and they encounter this, looks like a cargo ship or tanker just parked in the middle of what's supposed to be a dead moon or something, and they discover there are survivors on board, led by this man, Khan, who is familiar to Chekhov.
He's from Fantasy Island.
Even though Chekhov wasn't in the episode where Khan...
Chekhov hadn't been introduced in the show yet when Space Seed was made.
Well, I'll let you guys address Space Seed. I'm going to deal with the Wrath of Khan.
Okay.
But after being abandoned here at what was once a lush and very healthy world, a few months after they arrived, there was a catastrophe, and no one bothered to check on them, apparently. So they've been living a hard, brutal existence for a lot of years. And it's all Kirk's fault. So,
Revenge.
with the help of some absolutely terrifying, when I was in the single-digit age category, by the way, brain bugs, he starts infiltrating Starfleet to get his hands on Kirk and let the punishment begin. The lofty feel of science fiction and deepness that we had throughout the motion picture is gone, and what we get instead is explosions, an amazing Klingon performance from Christopher Lloyd, and a glistening proud chest of Ricardo Montalban.
Yeah.
And the fans were pleased, and so was Larry.
That's right.
Big fan of Wrath of Khan. No, you're not going to hear me talking shit about Wrath of Khan.
Well,
That shit's
you're
not
giving
gonna
it
happen.
just slightly too much credit.
Okay.
And that is that Christopher Lloyd's not in the second film.
I
This
fucked that up,
change in
sorry.
Star
2 and
Trek that
3.
you're talking about, you just got excited because they feel like they're the same story. They're
Yeah.
all part
Yeah,
of
that's
this
what I started to say.
three-movie
The
arc.
same improvement
Yeah.
over one is true of 3.
Yeah.
in
All
the
of
same
the
way.
original Star Trek can be boiled down to 2, 3, 4, right? If someone says, I want to know what Star Trek's about,
I don't know.
hold on now. If someone says, I want to know what Star Trek's about, and I only have an afternoon,
Right.
watch Star Trek's 2, 3, 4. You meet and know and care about the characters. You follow them on a journey. It takes you somewhere that ends in a sort of good place. I would say that's at least a valid approach to take. What we're hitting here at Star Trek 2 is a change of the guard. Star Trek 1, and part of why it was such a disaster, was that Roddenberry was still very much fingers in. He was not hands-on. Control was being wrestled... Gross. Control was being wrestled away from Roddenberry by Paramount. Roddenberry had more pull with when Desilu was producing for CBS, and now Paramount Feature Films is running Star Trek. They're trying to wrestle away control from him because he's going crazy. He doesn't want any interpersonal conflict. People can't have problems between them. It's the future. So, when you're writing, nobody can be at odds with one another. What? How do you write a show like that? And this is a concept that later he would push back into The Next Generation in 1986 when that show went into production. But at the time, studios pushing Roddenberry away, and even though the movie was a big financial success, it was a critical flop even at the time, right? Enter Harv Bennett, executive producer of Star Trek II. He wrote the original story outline. He fought tooth and nail with Roddenberry over what he said was an important change Star Trek had to make, which was, this is a military organization. People need to not be wearing multicolored uniforms where the enemy can identify you from 8,000 meters with a telescope and know exactly who the admiral is, right?
Yeah.
It's a peacekeeping Navy, but this is the Space Navy.
Yeah, they had to act like they're in the military.
Right. Exactly. And this is a story where, even though there are high-minded concepts, Star Trek was always compelling because of those 3 characters and because of the character drama, right? The stories are, in the original show, the memorable ones even have interesting concepts in them, but it's the interaction between those 3 characters that sort of just has me anyway, just sort of smiling as I watch those episodes. It's pleasant to watch those guys interact. We feel like we know them. Harv Bennett said, obviously, let's put them, like you said, back on the screen, for fuck's sake.
There are characters.
He also had to be the one who said, also, this is a Star Trek movie. James T. Kirk is the main character of Star Trek, so the story better fucking turn on something that happens to Kirk.
Right? And on something that happens to Kirk and Spock. Like, spoiler alert, we just brushed against the plot, but Spock sacrifices his life at the end of the movie to save the Enterprise, teaching interesting we mentioned Galileo 7 because I feel like that's when Spock actually first faced the Kobayashi Maru.
Yeah.
Right? They were dead in orbit. He vents the plasma, their only way to land safely, on the just dumb fucking luck gamble that someone might see it. And the Enterprise happens to just see it because they've got their sensors on maximum looking backward as they're being forced to leave the planet to do other things and abandon the search for Spock.
Right.
And his shuttle. They're leaving at space normal speed, which is as slow as the ship can possibly fucking go, right? And Kirk's disobeying orders in that way. He's bending the rules. So Spock already faced the Kobayashi Maru. At the end of Star Trek II, Spock tells Kirk, "What do you think of my solution to the Kobayashi Maru?" Which is Starfleet's test that commanders take to face a no-win scenario. You've done everything right, and the ship's still going to die. And you have to continue to function to the last moment.
Yeah.
Show us what you got. Face your own mortality, etc. Kirk, this is all buried in the same movie. It's full of such great stuff. Kirk cheats on this test when he's at Starfleet Academy. Now he's teaching this test hypocritically.
Right.
He's still a boy, right? We meet Kirk's son in this movie, and Kirk, I argue that James T. Kirk is not a man. He's a captain of a starship, but he's not. He doesn't step into his true manhood until the end of Star Trek II, when he faces the Kobayashi Maru finally, and he faces
loss.
He faces the loss of his best friend, and soon the loss of his son. Finally, after accepting fatherhood and accepting responsibility for the, impulsive behaviors of his youth, that the new movies just celebrate without ever really addressing the downside of Kirk being reckless, but. So much happens for Kirk in that movie. So much happens for Spock in that movie. A lot is set up to happen to McCoy in that movie, right? Spock transmits his consciousness into McCoy, setting up Spock's later reincarnation. There's so much meat on the bone for all three of those people. Other characters get, even little characters like Chekhov and Uhura have fun scenes in those movies.
Yeah. The balance is good.
It all, Star Trek II is Star Trek firing on all cylinders.
It should have been
the
Star Trek 1.
The warp engines are fucking tuned. Like Geordi and Scotty got together with Chief O'Brien, and maybe even the Hispanic American Klingon chick from Voyager, and the four of them tuned the engines of Star Trek for a week.
And just running smooth.
I think it speaks so highly of the film that when Star Trek II opens, you're reminded immediately that you needn't have seen anything from Star Trek 1. It's a sequel, but it doesn't matter at all. It really does confirm that rule that a good sequel doesn't require you to have seen the previous movie.
Absolutely.
In fact, it actually would be better if you hadn't seen 1.
Yeah.
You enjoy 2 more, I think, because when it starts and Kirk has all this worry about being too old to go gallivanting around the cosmos.
It seems more justified.
If you haven't seen 1, it feels like the time passage between the show and 2 earns that more than the fact that in 1 he's having the same contemplation, and by the end of the movie doesn't feel bad about it, and then he's right back there at the beginning of 2.
Right.
So it really hits the reset button in a way that kind of coyly says, we know we fucked up with 1.
It also jumps a bunch of time, right? Star Trek 2 takes place another 8 years or something after Star Trek 1. What supposedly happens in the timeline...
It's 5.
It's 5 years.
6 or something.
What is supposed to have happened in the timeline is the original series, that 5-year mission happened. Then the motion picture, we've jumped ahead a decade, I think.
Well, they never really decide, but yeah, it's something like 7 years.
Then Kirk wrestles command of the Enterprise back away from Decker, and Decker is killed, thus annihilating Kirk's competition, and he takes the Enterprise on another 5-year mission.
Right.
And then he gets promoted to Admiral and goes to work teaching other Starfleet captains, blah blah blah.
He's
head
of Starfleet
so
operations.
It's been a year or 2 after that 5-year mission,
and
that's where we catch back up to Kirk. He misses the center seat. Right, this is when we finally get the story that the first movie only took a tiny nibble at, which is Kirk is facing age, right? And it's interesting to see Kirk face his age and the fact that he's past his prime at the same time as he's facing his own coming of age story. He's finally becoming a man by facing things he's run from his whole life.
Well, 2 and 3 are sort of my Star Treks in that I had on a VHS tape when I was a kid, tape from television with little splorts to edit out the commercials, part 2 and 3 that were aired back to back. And in my head, they are one big movie. And in a lot of ways, they kind of are.
Yeah.
I mean, they do stand alone.
You don't need Star Trek 4 to feel like the story's over, but if you finish after Star Trek 2...
Yeah. And I didn't
There's
have
still a
Star
second
Trek
act
4 on tape, but these 2 movies I would watch a lot. And as part of the strength of this movie, over all the Star Trek movies, there were 2 scenes that like really definitely imprinted. Chekhov getting the bug in his ear.
Ugh.
Fucked me up. Like, that shit was scary. That was a scary sequence. It is one of the only genuinely horror movie sequences I can think of in Star Trek.
In the movies, anyway, yeah.
And like, it's pretty fucked up.
Not just that sequence, the whole mind control aspect, he and Captain Tyrrell being controlled by those bugs and fighting.
Body snatchers.
It's very body snatchersy, and it's one of the goriest moments in Star Trek 2 is when Tyrrell commits suicide with the phaser, and his body slowly vaporizes as he screams in agony. It's pretty brutal.
The other scene that I was going to talk about was what you mentioned was Spock's death. I was really, really shocked that Spock died, and I would actually I got something out of the funeral scene. I didn't mind watching the funeral scene.
Funeral for me,
but I would fast forward often. I remember the scene where Kirk goes down to talk to Spock at the end.
It's too upsetting.
I didn't like it. I would fast forward. I would watch the funeral. I would not watch the death.
That whole sequence, both of those scenes, really touching, right? The little things that both of those actors who'd been at this point playing those characters for a couple of decades had so much to draw on. They had so much in that script to work with too, and yet continue to put their little refining touches on it. Nimoy standing, straightening his tunic, that thing that Spock did because of their ill-fitting uniforms in the original series that had a weird zipper in the armpit, and they would ride up, and Nimoy developed the original Picard maneuver where whenever he stood up he would tug down his tunic. Spock straightens his tunic and then walks into the clear dividing barrier, and just, I don't know, you're right, the scene really feels like you're there with someone as he watches his best friend slowly die from radiation poisoning.
Not only that, but what do you think about, let me just throw something out and get your guys' read on it. Do you think Spock, rather than say, at the moment he decides, well, if we send somebody into the chamber who has the expertise to fix the engines, they'll die, but we'll get out of here.
Right.
Rather than say that and allow Kirk to make the decision, he just executes it himself. Does he do that because he knows that that's somehow more generous than ordering someone else to do it, or does he do it because he somehow thinks Kirk's incapable of doing that?
He knows. No,
that's
because
Kirk's
he knows.
fault?
Kirk tells him at the beginning when Spock is trying to tell him something on his birthday, as Kirk puts it later, when he gave him A Tale of Two Cities, and he's trying to give Kirk the message that, well, in that gift he's trying to give Kirk the message that he should probably try
be
to
doing
happy,
something else,
right? He should be doing something other than what he's doing, right? But he is. They have the disagreement, the fundamental philosophical disagreement about whether or not the individual is more important than the group, right? And he knows that in the case of Spock, that Kirk would be incapable of that, right? The good of the one does outweigh the
You
good
mean that
of the
he wouldn't
many.
send him
For
down
Kirk,
to do it?
That he wouldn't sacrifice him. He would continue to fight until it was too late to find an ingenious way to cheat.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Maru.
So not only does
He
it's
couldn't
his
face
best friend
death as
dying
Spock
inside,
could. Yeah.
but he knows he's dying because he made this choice as a result of my faults. His knowledge of me and the faults that I bring, he's made up for me.
Yeah.
So that all of us would live.
It's
That didn't hit me till the last time when we all watched it.
It's a very messianic sacrifice of Spock, who is interestingly reborn in the next movie.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I think the other reason that Spock chooses to make himself is that he has this Hail Mary pass that he might be able to save his own life.
Yeah, like nobody, when they do the the whammy ceremony to put his brain back in his body at the third movie. No one's done that for hundreds of years. Like, it really is, you're right, a long ball.
But it's a long ball that nobody else on board has.
That's right.
I find it interesting that because we watched them so close together, I'd never considered this before, but the little look that Spock does when they're doing the countdown and it's clear that they're not going to get out of range in time, and there's just a moment where he kind of cocks his head before he gets up and goes and leaves the bridge. And normally I just read it as him thinking like, well, I could probably affect that change to the engines and save her. I'd die, but we get out of here. But now I read it as, I could probably make that change, and based on what's going to happen, I might come back from the dead as well. Like, he's planned, in typical Spock form, he's planned like 19 chess moves ahead in one little moment. And because like after the fact, where the story goes, that moment can read as that whole equation happening in one moment.
In Spock's hyper-fast thinking. Yeah.
Question for the Star Trek fans. And I'm not saying that it was a bad decision or that there were better or worse ones, but why do you think they chose Khan for the villain? Like, obviously there was a few seasons of Star Trek.
Space Seed had been a big episode because Ricardo Montalban is, he's a heartthrob. People remembered the villain as being memorable, and he'd been, in the interim, become very famous for Fantasy Island. Funny as that might sound today, that show was huge at the time.
But as far as I'm concerned, Wrath of Khan, for me, was the last time Montalban was, like, culturally relevant, really.
And, it's
he
true.
Was also the only villain, I think, from all 3 seasons, who really should have beat Kirk.
Right.
He had the ability to best him, and really should have.
We're the adversary.
Just through like a minor miscalculation of his, which is he doesn't bet on the loyalty of Kirk's crew.
Right.
Yeah. It fits. Sorry if I'm cutting you off.
No, just like there isn't really any other option from the original series that provides a villain who has the ability to beat Kirk believably.
Yeah.
That's all.
They're looking for a story that fits with the theme of coming to terms with the mistakes or your past decisions, your past
their pasts are entwined.
Right. Kirk
wronged him in a way.
Kirk in his youth marooned these people, and you said that SETI Alpha 5 had at one point been lush. No, it hadn't. When Kirk, sort of like without trial,
he has the ability to.
He does, but he arbitrarily maroons Khan and his band of survivors on. It's a habitable planet, but it's barely habitable.
It's not
super nice. It's going to be a struggle, and that's addressed in the episode that they're going to do it. But hey, we're genetic supermen, so we can handle it. My people will be fine. Then the orbit of the planet shifts, and it gets way worse, and they're still able to survive. But Kirk still leaves them on this kind of shithole, and then doesn't come back. Starfleet doesn't come back, so
nobody
presumably
checks on
Kirk
them.
Doesn't set anything up. He must have talked about it in his log, but he also must not have filed the electro paperwork to get a ship to come check on them once.
It's actually kind of the probably the weakest point.
Kirk deserves
the
to have
structure
this
the movie
guy
hangs on is that nobody in all of Starfleet ever checked in on these genetic supermen who were just hanging out on some planet.
Because Kirk didn't go write the report. He just walked down the hallway laughing about things. Ha ha ha! Everything's worked out.
And that's kind of hard to believe.
I have to disagree with you that that's the weakest. That's the weak spot on the structure of Star Trek II. The weak spot is that we today have robots that could walk into that radiation chamber and pull that shit out of the dilithium chamber and fix it, right?
Yeah.
20 years later, Noonien Soong invents Data and lore in the Star Trek chronology, right?
Yeah.
And Data could have walked into that room and fixed the radiation, no problem, right? Lickety split. You could have done it faster than Spock too, probably while singing a tune. And so the sacrifice is in that Michael Okuda sense of everything has to fit together and make sense in the quote unquote the soft science fiction way. It illustrates the fact that that's there in the movie, and I don't give a shit. Speaks to the strength of the Harve Bennett movies, minus number 5, because I think that one doesn't stand in with the others. But Harve Bennett would, if somebody made that point to him, would say, "I don't care."
Yeah.
Right? He didn't care about that kind of thing. It's not
dramatically important.
Star Trek's about the characters. It's about the drama. It's about the message. It's about all of those things. The more you make it about the minutia, only the nerds are going to care, and even the nerds are going to be bored if it's about the minutia. And if you don't believe me, try and sit through Voyager, which was just the technobabble without any of the chemistry, or I guess they tried to make it a character drama, it just didn't work. But
the characters were just lame. That's all.
But the movies avoid largely, not completely, but that I find all of the Star Trek shows guilty of to degrees, is imaginary solutions to imaginary problems.
Yeah, it's not
the blah blah blah's not working. Well, if we blah 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 the blah blah blah, then just maybe we'll get out of this one.
And here the solution is not beyond reasoning. We know that radiation kills people.
Yes.
Right. The solution doesn't come in let's make up some new science that only the eggheads will be able to figure out what just happened.
Right.
Right. No, this character does something very clear, and it's a big thing that affects all of the characters. That scene still, what was this, 1982 this was made, right? So it's been a long time. It's now almost 2017.
Looks pretty good for 1982.
It really does. It holds up. We watched it on Blu-ray, and we watched all of these on Blu-ray. It looks better than I expected it to. It looks really good. And considering the fact that the budget for Star Trek 1 was almost $50 million, $1979, Star Trek 2, less than $12 million.
Wow. Yeah.
And
Harv Bennett came from TV, so he had a really scaled down sense of. He looked at what they were going to have and said, well, then we're going to tell this type of story, and made it better for it.
Right.
And made the people as recognizable, as similar to the people of today as you could believe, without it becoming counterproductive for a story set in the future.
Yeah.
Something else that one is horrible for. Mm-hmm. Everybody just sort of plods along in this kind of non-human haze because, like Roddenberry believed, people wouldn't have conflict, so we'd all be these kind of somewhat emotionless automatons with perfect hair and pajamas.
Which, isn't it interesting that Roddenberry, a guy who came up with the character of Spock, a character that really is good for examining the notion that it's important in order for a person to be healthy to be emotional, right, and to have inner turmoil and have problems, that he seeks to eradicate them in humanity. He doesn't want interpersonal conflict. Interpersonal conflict arises from humanity. The only way not to have it is for everyone to become like Spock. And Star Trek almost constantly argues that Spock is mentally unwell, right? He's the most repressed guy out there, and that the times when Spock
battling with mental illness.
Yeah, the times when Spock is most Spock are when he lets his humanity exist, right? And it seems like Roddenberry, in that notion of let's try and get all the conflict out.
I don't think he ever wanted to eradicate conflict from the stories. He didn't want there to be something that could be perceived as petty human conflicts. Like, he didn't want there to be
romantic
soapy. He didn't want there to be anything that could be seen as petty or like small time. He wanted there were just bigger fish to fry.
Part of that
in
too
his
is
mind.
that he was quite consciously writing a space western or wagon train to the stars when he wrote Star Trek, and Westerns didn't deal with that sort of thing either. That Westerns were unnuanced, black hat, white hat morality tales where there's a clearly right course of action and a clearly wrong course of action. So many stories in the original series are about Kirk disobeying orders because the right thing to do is so clear, and it, like, all of them are very much like that. It's interesting to fit it into the context of how that kind of thinking shaped the next 50 years too of American society. I'm not saying Star Trek did that. I think it was a symptom of that thinking in society.
Yeah. A couple of things I just wanted to mention because we're getting a little long in our Star Trek review. I think that we should mention Saavik a little bit.
Yeah.
Kirstie Alley plays her here, but she gets replaced for the next movie. It's one of those weird things when the casting changes. Sometimes it can be really bumpy. I find it relatively smooth here. It's not that Kirstie Alley is good or bad, but she's worthy of mentioning because I think that they set seeds here that, if that had been allowed to flourish, would have really helped a later installment of the movie.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the Star Trek 6 thing.
Correct.
Yeah, we'll get there.
basically the movie introduces a new character in a way that fits into the series and that we like, and
and which also enriches Spock's character and gives him more interesting arc as well.
Yeah, she's like mini Spock. She's like learning from.
She's as close as Spock has to a child anywhere in the story, right?
And also,
Kirk and Spock both get children finally in the same movie.
Isn't it kind of weird that to think that she was on paper really only introduced because this was Leonard Nimoy's very likely like his swan song, right? He was coming back under the understanding that he wouldn't be playing Spock anymore.
Really?
That remember thing where he touches McCoy on the face?
That was a failsafe?
They came up with that on the day. Harv Bennett just came over. It wasn't in the script, and they were about to play this scene, and he just said, "Leonard, what would be something like if you were gonna give like a parting gesture to McCoy? What would be something that would be appropriate for Spock to do?" And he thought about it for like 2 minutes before they filmed, and then he just said, "Well, I might touch him similar to a mind meld." And he's like, "Okay, and pick something to say, just like a word that you pair with it." So that's what they did. And it was because Harv Bennett was thinking, we can bring Spock back somehow, but if Nimoy won't return, we have this new Vulcan that's been introduced who can essentially become the new Spock.
Harv Bennett also understood the three-way chemistry, and Spock and Kirk have that incredible goodbye moment, and for the last thing that Spock ever does to McCoy to be to just deceive him, nerve pinch him, and then go kill himself, right? It's quite touching, actually, that Spock cares enough in that moment to, whether he's going to live or not, he wants to, touch with McCoy's mind for a minute. He's important to Spock.
I am genuinely surprised to hear that, though, because I was going to say when we were wrapping this up that if I had a complaint about this movie is that I think they spent a lot of time setting the table for the next movie, and I guess that's just not the case. I'm imagining that.
Well, no, I think Harv Bennett was just a really smart producer, and he knew there's no reason I can't leave the door open to this without cheapening the film somehow, because if Nimoy never came back, it would function the way it was intended script-wise, and
like they deposited his body on the Genesis planet.
They didn't need Leonard Nimoy to film that.
Yeah, but that seems so specific. Like that planet was being generated, life was being created.
Yeah, but Nimoy didn't have to know all of that when Bennett wrote the story,
or at least the shot of
wrote the screenplay,
the torpedo tube, intact on the planet's surface.
You didn't need Nimoy for that.
I felt anyway like they knew Star Trek 3 was going to happen, and they were setting the table for that, and I have no problem with that.
Well, by the time it hit the screen, they knew, because the movie ends with the story of whatever continues, doesn't it? That Star Trek 2 end with that? Star Trek 1 ends with the human adventure continues, and Star Trek 2 I thought also ended with a sort of we'll be back ...
Nimoy has just said in interviews and in his books that when he filmed Spock's death scene, he was very much under the impression that
Spock was
he was fucked up that day, because when he came to set, it was the
This
first
is
time
the
in
last time I
ages
do
that
the
he was
ears.
like, what do I do? Like I'm emotional, and it's completely inappropriate because I can't be in this scene. And he'd never encountered that with Spock before. If anything, it was much more the opposite, where Spock would filter into his real life, and he'd have to like turn it off, and that would be the problem. And here it was the other way functioning. So that only happened because he was like, very likely this is the last time I'll play this character. By his own design, he didn't want to keep playing him. He wanted to be done with it. He was in that period of his life where he had just written I'm Not Spock a couple of years earlier, and wanted. He liked Star Trek, but he wanted to move away from it.
I don't think people can really understand, unless they were like really in on it, what a big deal Spock dying was culturally at the time too.
Right.
It was.
He was the most recognizable element of Star Trek, was him in his ears.
Yeah, the Vulcan salute, the V with the fingers, and Mr. Spock. If you said, hey, what do you know about Star Trek? They'd say Mr. Spock.
Yeah.
Right? That's what everybody would say.
Yeah.
And the funeral scene, we barely talked about it, which is too bad, because I think it's incredible. There's so much in that scene. But
if you're going to make fun of William Shatner before you do so, watch the funeral scene.
In that moment, when he takes the pause, when he says, he's delivering the eulogy, and he says, and in all my travels, talking about all the places he's explored, and of all the souls he's encountered, Spock's was the most human. And he takes a pause in there, a dramatic Shatner-esque pause. It's also a very Kirk-esque pause. And in that moment, as his eyes are glassing up, you can see Kirk running through a thought process of, would Spock forgive me for saying this at his eulogy, for calling him a human, and thinking how human Spock's final act had been to give up his life to save his friend, and not only do that, but to do it in a deceitful way, like you said, that he knew Kirk wouldn't be able to do it, and Spock was counting on Kirk's humanity to be able to forgive him for what he's done.
I think he also realizes in that moment nobody has taught him more about being human
than Spock.
Yeah,
absolutely right. He's well aware of the fact that that he'd run from his responsibilities. He knows he's responsible for Khan and for everything that's just happened, and for this loss, and for all of the people that Spock wasn't able to save. And here he is standing there with the body of his best friend at his feet, with all of these people looking to him, standing and respecting him, and he's feeling like it's like he realizes in that moment that he hasn't earned any of it, and he has to start earning it today. And that's why in the next scene, when he's looking out the window and McCoy says, "How do you feel?" he smiles and says, "I feel young." And it's, he's been reborn. He's stopped running from everything he's been running for, and his life is able to start.
Well, actually, even in between, he has to be taught a lesson, because in between those two scenes is when David comes to see him, and
I think
the only reason David comes to see him is because Saavik has told him something.
That's right.
So Vulcan has intervened again to give him some information that he uses for Kirk to be able to start the process of being bigger than he was and being better.
The big thing that we keep hitting is that Kirk suffers a loss. Like, he wins the day, Khan doesn't get his revenge, obviously, but Kirk suffers a loss. And I don't think, unless it's one of the episodes that I haven't seen, we'd ever seen that. Kirk was always the guy who found a way to win. He didn't win because he was amazing. He won because he fucking refused to lose, right? And he finally loses. And at the end of Star Trek 2, you're kind of like, well, where do we go from here? And please get Star Trek 3 to me as soon as possible, which is the polar opposite of my reaction at the end of most
It does actually happen in the series. But
we had seen him lose, well, for instance, his old friend Matt Decker, who we mentioned earlier. But that's not a loss for the audience at all. We'd met him that episode.
His brother dies in one episode horribly.
His brother and his sister-in-law die actually
horribly.
In that episode. Horribly.
And in the episode before that, we talked about City on the Edge of Forever. The reason I think it's one of the best ones that non-fans should see is because, for the same quality, at the end of the episode, even more so because he loses because he chooses it.
Right.
He realizes everything's more important than me.
Right.
So in the moment he can't, and it's kind of like he doesn't think about it. He's, because of how he's chosen to be, he can't not make the choice to put other people ahead of him.
Yeah.
So it's like we're exposed to his tragic flaw, I guess, that cost him this love of his life.
We're at 33 minutes.
We have one last thing that we have to talk about.
I was going to say, we're at 33 minutes, so is there anything else we want to say before we wrap the show?
Yes, we've talked a lot about the great, Harv Bennett, who I think, he really made Star Trek. He gives me a Star Trek boner, just to mention his name. But there's another there are many great people attached to it, but there's another genius Star Trek genius attached to this movie, and that is Nicholas Meyer, who directed the movie. And I don't know if we mentioned him, he also co-wrote the screenplay.
Yeah.
Right? And he
obviously knew his shit.
He knew his shit. He would
this
later
is only
direct...
his second movie.
It is, right.
Wow.
And then he'd later direct Star Trek 6, also a strong entry in the Star Trek movies that we're talking about.
And he co-wrote 4.
He co-wrote 4, and he's, not showrunner, but isn't he writing the writer's room?
No, he keeps saying
running the writer's room?
He's just working on staff.
He's working on the staff for the new Star Trek show. He's one of the higher ups at the new CBS Star Trek show.
It feels like younger blood to me. As much as I love Wise as the filmmaker and have a lot of respect for him, I think that for this type of science fiction adventure, you need someone who's really going to...
But I think one of the he brought a lot to this movie. He brought a lot to Star Trek, and one of the many good decisions CBS seems to be making about the new show, what's it called, Star Trek Discovery?
Yeah.
Is bringing Nick Meyer in. A lot of the great Star Trek talent.
I think it was a perfect cocktail in that Harv Bennett had a really strong sense of how to make this movie way better than the first one, like how the first one misfired, how the people involved in making it didn't get what made the show great, and how to transpose that, hopefully, to a feature film format. And then he went out and hired somebody who didn't need to know Star Trek that well. He just knew character dynamics really well and was able to make a
Exactly,
really
because Bennett,
entertaining film regardless of whether it was a Star Trek movie.
Yeah.
And all the basics of Star Trek were covered in
Right.
advance of bringing
Bennett
it
had the
director.
story himself, and then he wrote the screenplay with Meyer, and Meyer didn't have to know dick about Star Trek. He just needed to know movies.
Yeah.
Know how to tell a story. Is there anything you want to say, Jan, before we wrap this
No,
one up?
I rattled on enough.
Yeah, we're good.
I think we've been pretty fair about it. Like, we're all huge fans of that.
We are.
All that they've loved, all that they've fought for, all that they've stood for will now be put to the test. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock.
The word, sir?
The word is no. I am therefore going anyway.
You do this, you'll never sit in the captain's chair again.
Engage auto systems. Clear all moorings.
Cleared, sir.
1/4 impulse power.
Someone is stealing the Enterprise.
Warp speed.
Klingon bird of prey, sir. She's arming torpedoes.
Shields up.
The shield's non-responsive.
We're a sitting duck.
Join us on this, the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. The adventure continues.
So here's a fun fact about Star Trek 3 that I learned because of my personal affinity to the Friday the 13th franchise. What? Here's a thing that almost happened. Star Trek 3D.
The Revenge.
3D
this time it's
was
personal.
going to be, 3D did come into vogue for a while in
Around the
genre
same time,
movies
right?
in the 80s. Friday the 13th Part 2, Jaws 3,
Jaws 3 was
Amityville.
83, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
Amityville, but the real sort of test of it was the first one out to the gate, I believe, was Friday the 13th Part 2. And they were looking very carefully at how they were going about getting the 3D and what the 3D response was. And the box office on Friday the 13th Part 3 was, like all of the early Fridays, incredible.
Yeah.
But in the end, they decided, you know what? Let's not do 3D. Let's put the 3D money into doing a completely computer animated sequence.
The Genesis Wave.
Oh.
Which was, interestingly, the first fully computer-generated sequence in movie history, like including Tron.
But it's interesting that for that, 35 seconds of footage?
Yeah, it's less than a minute. It's gotta be.
They said, we'll do that or we'll do 3D, and they chose that. And
Which
it
is why
was
they-
the right call.
Yeah, the movie's better for it. There's probably Harv Bennett again.
Well, and here's
showing his wisdom.
sorry to do this to you twice, Larry, but that footage is in Star Trek 2 and then reused in Star
Did
Trek
they
3.
reuse it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. Then I
But
must have been
82.
known for... Anyway, the
But
truth
isn't that
of it
interesting
is,
that was all done in that 11 million, first use of CG?
What's true about it is that they were very much considering going 3D on it.
Yeah.
And I like that in the idea of, like, wow, this could be a potential for, like, cool visual landscapes, but because they were continuing a story that wasn't in 3D, and because it adds such another layer of complexity to the shooting, especially at this time, we're talking the red lens, blue lens, 3D, like primitive.
And they had a
plastic
first-time
glasses.
director for
Yeah,
3. So.
it would add so much complexity. It would slow down the shoot so much that they decided against it in the end. And it's just interesting. It's like another alternate reality universe where this Star Trek 3 doesn't exist, but there's Star Trek 3.
I can just see Harv Bennett pacing around his room, being like, "Are you fucking kidding me? I just got this thing back on the rails."
Yeah, and now they want this gimmicky bullshit.
But as I keep doing, I guess 2 and 3 is almost one gigantic movie in my mind. That's my problem. I bring that baggage to it. So as far as I'm concerned, Wrath on Khan, second act. The second act's not quite as good as the first act, but I do think
it's shorter, which a second act always should be. So
yeah.
it has that going for it.
I think it's really good, and most of it has to do, and unsurprisingly because of the title, of them trying to track down Spock.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the Genesis planet has reignited with life, and with it, so has Spock. And meanwhile, the Klingon Empire has got interest in this weapon, which, although it was designed to create it, of course, could be used as an incredible weapon.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a planet destroyer as much as a planet creator.
Could be, yeah.
So we get all these pawns moving into place, and we get to see some epic badassery.
It's also a Spock creator.
That's
the
right.
Genesis weapon just happens to be exactly what ends up leading to the search for Spock.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, it's a direct I think it happens like immediately following. It's like there's a few months or something in between.
The only reason they get back to Earth and space dock so slowly is because they can only fly so fast.
Right.
Because of the battle damage, presumably, and they've dropped people off on the way, like David and Savick are on the Grissom. And
some time has passed, but it's
feels like a month maybe or a month.
No, I think it's longer than a month. Like
really.
Well, it feels more connected to the previous film than usually these sequels do, and I kind of like that. It acknowledges what happened before, and what happened before obviously is going to play big in what we see here.
Yeah.
The fans willed Spock back to life then, I guess. I was genuinely surprised to hear that he was meant to die, but no, we're going to bring Spock back, and that's going to give us even more Star Trek money.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nimoy, it also just might have been some leverage tactics, right? I want to direct. He really wanted to direct. And maybe he knew all along that, yes, I will let them twist my pointed ear into coming back to play Spock again. But in the interim, I'm going to get behind the camera and I'm going to earn some street credit as a director.
He very much approached each film as its own thing. Like, he had no master plan like maybe Harve Bennett did. Yeah. And he just looked at it as, is this character still interesting? Is there something outside the character interesting in the project? So with 3, I think he realized or decided, well, if I direct it, that's worth showing up at the end as Spock and putting a nice little bow on.
And let's be honest,
this for the fans.
He walked away.
The fans want it.
Yeah, and then if there was no 4, which there, in his mind, maybe there won't be, right? That's why at the end it says, "And the adventure continues."
Yeah.
Is because it's this non-committal, they're still out there type of thing, right?
Shatner, when a Star Trek movie is wrapped, says, "I hope there's another one."
Yeah.
Nimoy says, "If there's another one where Spock has something interesting to do, yeah, sure, I'll do it." Right, that's his commitment.
He had always maintained this since the show ended, this like distance from Spock, and
I am not Spock.
It was really troubling to him to be so closely associated with it, and he was always so worried about being pigeonholed and that kind of thing.
Well, when you haven't played the character in a decade and a half, and you're driving down the street and people are saying, "Oh, Mr. Spock," hollering at you, and after Spock, like, his acting career did not exactly skyrocket. He
actually, years later, he was very vocal about the fact that once he got Spock, never again in his life did he worry about work. He never had to worry about ever being employed again because of Spock. So he was very grateful for that, but that doesn't mean that what he was employed doing was what he wanted ideally to be employed doing.
Right.
He just didn't have to worry about money. He also became an alcoholic during the series. So that probably added a level of...
I thought he was an alcoholic before going into the series.
That's when he realized he was an alcoholic.
Well, shooting
he
the
kind of blamed the shooting schedule, the pressure of playing Spock and having to be so emotionally removed all the time, because that's how he played. He didn't know how to play it any other way.
Yeah. Right? For anybody who's interested in these guys in the behind the scenes Star Trek stuff, there's a fantastic documentary called Mind Meld that it's just Nimoy and Shatner sitting in Nimoy's backyard on a lovely June day having a conversation about what it's like to be the cultural icons of Kirk and Spock, and they tell stories about their addictions and their friendship and all of their
what it did to their life,
and the same time, like, Nimoy shares how much he respected Shatner for his ability to quit smoking, and he tells an anecdote about Shatner quit smoking while shooting the first season of Star Trek, and that he would be just like keyed up because he was having a Nick fit and they're shooting and the day's going long, and like any kind of expensive sci-fi television, it's going to be really like repetitive and a lot of waiting, and he's just and he would just march outside the throw the studio doors open, walk out onto the Paramount lot and shout at the cosmos, just, "I want a cigarette!"
But he wouldn't have it.
And everyone on the soundstage would hear it, and there'd be a few beats of silence, and then, the ragged Bill Shatner who'd walked out the door would walk back in, the suave, fucking collected James Tiberius Kirk, ready to nail the scene.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Nimoy's assistant is standing stage side with a styrofoam cup filled to the brim with vodka, so that the moment they wrap for the day,
at exactly 6:05 when they were
drinking,
wrapped, he could start drinking
on his way back to his trailer, where he would hit a full bottle. Right, and like, he tells stories about on his birthday, being passed out drunk by 2 before guests arrived,
Yeah.
and sleeping through
And
his birthday
he
parties
doesn't
routinely, like
Wow.
more than
He doesn't
once.
hang it all on Star Trek. He just talks about how it was during the filming of the series, somewhere in the second season, where he started ritually drinking, and it was because the pressure of the shooting day and
the
I'm
need
sure
to
the
numb
pressure
yourself.
of playing Spock for the shooting day
Yeah.
heavily contributed to him feeling like I need the release at the end of the day,
Yeah.
and then that drink became more drinks and blah blah blah.
Well, I want to pull it back to Star Trek 3.
Star Trek
a little
3.
bit.
Yeah.
Yes, do it.
I do think, like I said earlier, that the fans wanted Spock back, and that they wanted Spock back, and that whether they admitted it or not, I think somewhere along the line that this was an inevitability.
Yeah.
But I think the way they buy themselves out of bringing Spock back, because that was such a big deal, is they kill David.
Kirk's son.
You mean
Kirk's
like
son.
dramatically the way that they can allow it, or what?
Well, it was in a way like we needed. Kirk lost, right? And in a way, getting
He can't win that back without losing
Exactly.
something else. Yeah,
Like,
it doesn't dramatically function. It's not satisfying. It's gotta
exactly
lose
in
something
a way,
equal
it
to
would almost undo a lot of what the Part 2 accomplished. And a
Well-
lot of what Part 2 accomplished was built into the death of Spock.
Yeah.
So Spock's comes back
For
to
Kirk,
life.
what it accomplished for Kirk's character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Spock does come back to life, but narratively, it costs the life of David.
Yeah.
There's some blood. Yeah.
Thus not cheapening the lessons Kirk and the growth Kirk
Well,
underwent.
People
in the
make
second
fun
movie.
of it,
But
but when
might
I was a
cheapen it.
kid, the scene where David dies and he has that "you Klingon bastard, you killed my son."
Yeah.
I was
Another really great piece
I
of
was
shacking.
all fucking in. Like I was practically on my feet because that was almost more of a shock for me as a kid than Spock's death, because Spock's death made sense. Spock's death had weight and purpose.
Right.
There was something really
It's a choice.
sudden and brutal about
And the
David.
randomness of it, that Christopher Lloyd's Commander
Doesn't even say
Krug-
kill David. He
Commander
just says
Krug,
kill
one of them.
Pick
I don't
one of
care
them and kill-
which.
He doesn't care which, and then we don't find out until the knife goes in, and Kirk doesn't find out until after
Savick
the
tells him.
death rasps are heard, and
Yeah.
Savick says
David is
David
dead.
is dead. Right.
It's an incredible, like for me, an incredibly powerful scene, and one of like again, I think that I might have almost felt that it was cheapened that they brought Spock back, but that bought them out of it dramatically, and I tie these two movies together so much that, like I've said, sort of they're almost the same movie. I would agree that the second Part 2 is better for me, but I got a lot of love for number 3.
I honestly think Part 3 has, if not the more well-explained and well-explored villain, Christopher Lloyd's Klingon doesn't have, Commander Krug doesn't have all of that backstory informing Khan, but he's, I think, maybe a more memorable screen villain.
I love the details on the Klingon ship. I love John Larroquette. I love the Klingon dog.
The Klingon dog is great, yeah, and just there's some. It's interesting that the villains are also the main source of, not the main source. There's a lot of comic relief in that movie. It comes in little moments like the "Don't call me tiny" Sulu moment
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. Get in the closet when Uhura, is that in number
He's
3?
fruity as a nutcake.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that Christopher Lloyd, the guy who kills Kirk's son and is the big bad of the movie, is also having to do with the lighthearted little moments. Maltz.
Joy,
Choo.
Yeah.
Well, there is a weird rough charm to the Klingons. I mean, I don't want to have a drink with them. They're not going to be my buddies, but you know what you're getting with Klingons, right?
Right.
And I kind of dig.
That's why they're fan favorites, because when they show up, you know what you're getting.
Yeah. No, they're going to use any excuse to fight because that's what they're here to do. Fight, goddammit.
Yeah.
We always know what to expect of Klingons, and we can expect good times when they're around.
And I guess Klingons are another villain that they did bring from the show, although they've gotten an interesting makeover.
Update. Well, they get it in the first movie. You just barely see them in the first
That's
movie.
right.
They're central in this.
They get
one.
the
Not a good
aesthetic
Trekkie.
update of the forehead ridges, and the ship, right? No, the ships look like that. The D7 or whatever it's called, cruisers from the beginning of.
And
They
interestingly,
look like that in the original series too, but it's
Yeah.
in Star Trek 3 where we first see the Klingon
the
bird of prey.
yeah.
The little guy that originally it had always been a Romulan bird of prey that we'd heard of in the old series, but yeah, that famous Klingon ship, the one that cloaks, we had never seen before Star Trek 3.
We have another casualty that we haven't mentioned, too.
Yeah, I've been waiting to bring it up. Not only does he lose his son, but he loses his ship, which he's had a longer relationship with. It's not more important to him.
Yeah.
But
making
it's
that decision
maybe
and doing
more
that
important
call.
to the audience.
Yeah.
You know, like they. I was too young to see this movie in the theater, or if I did, I don't remember it. But I can remember seeing it and being really like hollowed out when the Enterprise.
That was the final straw
destroyed.
that fucked the camel between Paramount and Roddenberry too, hey, and between Bennett and Roddenberry, and it's
That
what
he
finally
blew up the
allowed.
Enterprise?
No, that Roddenberry leaked it because he was enraged that they were going to blow up the Enterprise, so he leaked it to the public, and Paramount found out it was him, and they
booted him, right?
They booted him. They froze him out of really any kind of creative control at all.
Yeah,
and that's how he was finally taken down.
But you know, dramatic stakes. Again, this is a movie, not a TV show. We're going to bring it up. It's interesting to me that like the Enterprise, we do get the Enterprise back, much like we get Spock back. But for the next movie entirely, no Enterprise.
Yeah,
and that's
because the characters are more important.
Yeah,
that's why the fourth one functions.
Yeah, that's such a huge part of Star Trek to me, and especially the little kid part of me. I really like the space shooting part, right? It's just like, and it's interesting that they stick to their guns. Like the next movie, much like Part 3, is going to continue almost more or less directly after this.
Yeah, it's 3 months later.
But close enough. Right?
Yeah.
So they're still flying around in this fucking Klingon bird of prey.
Yeah.
And it still feels Star Trek. I like that they're making big swings here. They're taking big chances. So, you know.
Well, it's a movie about laying everything on the line because you don't feel like you have any. Like he says at the end, if I hadn't tried, the cost would have been my soul.
Yeah.
The lesson he's learned in this one is that there's times when doing something is worth everything else, potentially. Yeah. It's not quite as meaty a lesson, and I think the reason that this one feels kind of not weak, but just like a lesser film than the second one is because it is essentially all in service of bringing Spock back.
It is.
That's really the only like larger goal that's affected.
It's
the story's interesting, but it's way more of like a rip-roaring 2-part episode.
Yeah.
You know, by today's standards.
Structurally, Star Trek 2, the climax of it is Spock's sacrifice, right? That whole chase to get away from Khan's exploding ship.
Yeah.
In Star Trek 3, that same moment is Kirk kicking Christopher Lloyd in the face and making a crack. Right? I have had enough of you!
Yeah.
And here's what I will say.
It's a Looney Tunes, like, Wile E. Coyote drop in the lava.
And I love it.
It's a weaker moment, though.
As a mark against it. I love it, too. I've had enough of you. They're kicking of him, too. But, again, we have to fall back on the stakes of what has just happened. Right. This is Kirk avenging the death of his son and the destruction of the Enterprise. And as far as he knows, imminent death's about to happen. And there is something about that fight, about the way the ground's constantly caving in below them and above them, and they fall onto ledges and they dance above molten lava, that it's like every supervillain fight from every movie all at once.
And the soundstage they built for that is to this day impressive. The way the ground is cracking and heaving.
The fight is not that impressive.
I'm not saying it's poorly done. The fight is the choreography is mad, but that's
and the way they film super like tight so that you can't tell that
they're on
neither of them is doing a very good job because Christopher Lloyd can't move.
They're just sort of walking around.
As far as an over-the-top villain fight in a crazy environment, it almost becomes parody. It could be in a movie making fun of movies like this.
Yeah.
Like, it pushes it pretty far, but because we want Christopher Lloyd to go down so hard, we let that shit
When
go.
I watch that sequence, I just wait on the edge of my seat for when Kirk launches himself off the cliff and goes, "Ah!" and jumps on him. That's the only moment in the whole scene where I genuinely feel like I'm having the reaction this scene's supposed to make me have. And the rest of it is basically, I feel like Leonard Nimoy's inexperience as a director is showing a little bit, and maybe their budget restrictions are showing a little bit.
Although it did have a bigger budget than
two. They're trying to give you a big finish, to their credit. Like, they're trying to give you a big finish.
And a different big finish than the previous film. That's what I love about the 2, 3, 4 is that they have very different priorities in terms of, well, we just did this, so let's do something else purposefully.
For me, I think that 1 or 2 less falls, 1 or 2 less ledges. The lava was probably overdoing it. There's just a few little things. I also wanted to say that this movie has one of my favorite moments in Klingon ever. When the Klingons first get down and find the casket that Spock was in, there were these bugs that got hypergrown because of the Genesis project.
Planet,
So instead of being little microbes, they're these huge snake-like things. What does the Klingon do? Does he take out his phaser and shoot it? Does he even fucking stab it? No.
Fucking figures
He
out where
takes
its
his
throat
hands
is
and he kills this thing.
Picks one up with his
fucking
hands, waits for it, to
because
choke
it's
him.
there.
Yeah.
It's not even a sentient creature. It's just like
well, Klingons kill things for the same reason Kirk climbs mountains, I guess, right? Because it's there.
And then they give him the line, "Nothing interesting going on down here." Like he gets on his communicator just to make it even more commonplace. Like he does that every morning.
I
after
just
breakfast.
kill stuff every day.
Like this is the only creature of its kind in the universe. He's like making it extinct at this moment.
It's got another one of my favorite Klingon moments too, and I guess it's less of a Klingon moment, but it's during that great sequence of the self-destruct of the Enterprise when they walk onto the bridge, and then there's just one thing speaking, and it's the countdown time.
Counting.
Yes, it speaks.
Speaking. Let me hear.
Let me hear.
Yeah. And another great payoff too, dramatically. It's been a one-way beating for the crew of the Enterprise for such a long time. So when all those Klingons get blown up, and we see, like, the Christopher Lloyd's character just lose his fucking mind.
Yeah.
Like he just lost his crew. Victory is going to be empty at this point, but he's still gonna get fucking victory.
Yeah.
Love it.
I love the heist sequence too, the stealing of the Enterprise, the sabotaging of the Excelsior's engines, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Number 3, even though Spock's not there, and maybe it's because Spock's not there, 2 is great on all the levels we already discussed. 3 is sort of like a rootin' tootin' Star Trek movie. It's got the heist of the Enterprise, it's got the chase to the Genesis planet, it's got the big fisticuffs at the end where I believe, well, not only does Kirk do the whole body throw where he jumps on the guy, like, but he also doesn't he do a backflip Gorn style?
He
where
kicks him
he
and
does the
cat
crunch
catches his foot and flips him back over himself.
Christopher Lloyd does the backflip,
which is a really good stunt, but that and then the dive off the cliff. The rest is just them sort of.
But it's
walking
rootin'
about.
tootin', and then 4 we get the comedy. We get like Star Trek meets Croc Dundee, which we're about to talk about.
We'll get there.
The movies function on different levels, and this one functions well.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention, you brought up the moment where he realizes David's been killed.
Yes.
I actually feel like maybe it's because the speech at the end of 2, where most people associate that as like Shatner shining the brightest he ever did. I feel like it's actually the moment in 3. And
you Klingon bastard, you've killed my son.
Well, just from the moment he hears it, because he's failed utterly to do the thing that even he assumes he'll be able to do, which is like save the day somehow.
He's always been
Everyone
able to.
assumes that about him. And once that's happened, at that moment, it's the closest you ever see Kirk to being hopeless.
Yeah.
And I think just as a performance moment, it speaks volumes to him as a performer that Nimoy didn't even know, and he's the director of the fucking movie, and the only person who was on set other than the camera guy. They cleared the set for that scene, so the actors are there who are in the shot. Everyone else is gone. And when he hears the line and then stumbles backwards and like trips back,
trips into
even
his
Nimoy
seat.
didn't even know whether that was performance or accidental.
Right.
And he went up to him afterwards and asked him, and Shatner never told him.
Right.
He just like let it hang.
Yeah.
So I love not knowing
whether he tripped on purpose,
whether it's performance or whether it was just a happy accident. But either way, if
either
he
way,
tripped
it's performance
and kept
He
going.
used it.
It's performance
It's
either way.
just brilliant. You
It's
know,
whether it's choice or not.
I think
it's that moment that I refute when people say that William Shatner was talentless or just a joke or whatever. It's really that scene that makes me not agree with them.
I think it's the one genuinely shocking moment in the movie. The movie's called The Search for Spock, and we fucking know how it's gonna end.
Yeah.
Right?
And when the Enterprise blows up, you see it coming because they do the countdown, and you know that's happening.
But at the end of Star Trek 2, we didn't see the death. At least I didn't see the death of Spock coming.
Yeah, nobody did.
So I think that might be the reason. I think that other than the death of David, nothing really surprised us about Part 3, and Part 2 maybe had more to reveal. But they're both great, and like I said in my head, they're practically one movie.
We didn't get to touch on the fact that DeForest Kelley probably has more meat to chew on here than anywhere else, where he gets to play the halfway crazed, tortured McCoy who talks to himself. He goes to bars in the middle of San Francisco, like weird alien bars, and tries to solicit a ride to the Genesis planet, which is Genesis is planet forbidden.
Yeah.
McCoy gets to do some fun stuff.
I love the stuff
typically
that
he tends to get the short shrift out of those three, hey?
Yeah.
Usually he gets a pep talk once an episode or once a movie and a couple of wry lines, but he was possessed of Spock.
McCoy has spent so long trying to crack the nut that is Spock. What makes Spock tick? And now McCoy is just full to the brim with Spock.
Yeah.
He's got Spock's consciousness rattling around inside of him. He's way closer than he's ever felt he wanted to be to Spock. And, you know, I guess, does he really understand Spock any better after that? He doesn't seem to.
DeForest Kelley is an actor who can overdo it sometimes for me, and I don't think he does. It's one of those things that when you're playing something that weird, it's real easy to overplay your hand, and I think he handles it well.
In the same way that all the performances are best viewed in context of the time, too, is especially, I think, of the main three is best viewed that way. But I just wanted to also point out that the one of the biggest things I like about 5 is the same thing I like about this, which is he gets a chance to do something of worth rather than just kind of tagging along.
Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a fill in the blank.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there anything else we want to say about Search for Spock?
No.
Thanks,
Never.
guys.
Let's never speak of it again.
And so ends part 1 of our 2-part trek into outer space and into the world of Star Trek. I hope you're enjoying it, because in 2 weeks we're going to be hearing another episode. Part 1 has been entitled Double Dumbass on You at the Insistence of One Paxton Francis, a fun and obscure reference from a movie that we haven't even got around to referencing yet. That one's for you, Paxton. And for the rest of my Rank and Review listeners out there, please send feedback to rankandreview@gmail.com. Please seek out the show on Facebook and on iTunes. Please tell your other friends about this little podcast. And thank you, as always, so very much for listening to my show.